Hey there, world. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna, and I'm happy to have you tuning in. So, I know we recently started a series of episodes on retirement planning, in which each week we're going over a particular topic or insight on retirement as we know it today. But this week we're going to take a quick break as we feature our monthly guest, who is none other than Dr. Donald Vandegrift. Dr. Vandegrift is a professor of economics at the College of New Jersey. Full disclosure, that is my alma mater. And he's received his bachelor's in economics from the College of William and Mary and a PhD also in economics from the University of Connecticut. His primary areas of research are urban issues and experimental and behavioral economics, especially focusing on crime and policing. So, definitely some timely expertise for what's going on in our country today. His research has appeared in many renowned journals, including the Landscape and Urban Planning Journal, the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Journal of Neuroscience, Psychology, and Economics, and many, many more. Much of his research has been funded from grants through the National Science Foundation, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and the Institute for Humane Studies. So, aside from being an all around great guy, Dr. Vandergrift has quite a bit of experience on topics that right now happen to be front page news in America. So, as you join us over the next hour or so, our conversation begins with what's happened since the murder of George Floyd, what's going on with policing today, particularly with Black Lives Matter and the Defund the Police movement. Then we transition into another area of his expertise, which happens to be sanctuary cities and what's going on with sanctuary cities. So I know that these are certainly touchy topics. They're emotionally charged. They've become great fodder for political debate. But I encourage you to listen to us throughout the next hour or so as we really look at things from the eyes of an economist and we tease out a lot of the different statistics and some of the viewpoints that do affect these matters and what some of the consequences might be, intended or otherwise. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, Dr. Donald Vandegrift.
The Caderna Podcast. The Caderna Podcast.
The Caderna Podcast.
Don, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Brian.
Yep. Yeah, it's always great to kind of go back to my roots and speak with some folks from TCNJ.
Glad to be on the show.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. So just to clue in some of our listeners, I know you have a very diverse background here, of course, with a specialty in economics. But how did you kind of get that interest in economics? Where did that all come from?
Well, as a high school student, I just loved reading the newspaper, and newspaper articles on just about every public policy topic have an economic question at their core. And that's what spurred my interest in studying economics and then, of course, working in the field following my graduation.
That's interesting. Yeah, I tell a lot of my friends oftentimes when we speak about economics is that it kind of affects every decision you could think of, whether it's international trade or should we order a pizza pie tonight or go out for steaks? They're all economic decisions in some way, shape, or form.
Right. And as a financial planner, I'm sure you're well aware of that.
Without a doubt. And so did you dive right into, being a professor, or was there a career prior to teaching?
I had a brief career, and it wasn't my plan as an undergraduate to end up as an educator. Following graduation, I went to work for the federal government in a division of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that evaluated electric utility rate filings for compliance with federal regulations. And at that time, deregulation of electricity was coming down the pike, and I figured that would be a very exciting area to get into. But in order to get into the division that wrote the rules, as opposed to check for compliance with the rules, you had to have a master's degree. So my plan was just to go back to school and get a master's degree and return to either that position or a similar one involved in writing federal rules in regulated markets. But once I got in front of a classroom, I decided that maybe that was for me. And I've been doing that now for more than 25 years.
Wow, that's a pretty cool journey. And so when you got into teaching, was there a particular niche that you had pursued, or it was more like a general economics?
Well, as any graduate student in your typical program will tell you that when they send you off to teach the first time, they start you with a principles class. And following that, you sometimes graduate to running an upper level class at the time you get close to completing your dissertation. So that was my path, typical of most graduate students. I maintain my interest in the microeconomic area just because of the background in regulation. But it shifted slightly towards economics of law and then into behavioral economics and land use over time.
Interesting. And before we get into your real areas of expertise, I just wanted to touch base on how you think, colleges are doing right now with, especially with the pandemic going on, everything going remote. Um, do you have any idea if enrollment perhaps could be going down, or if schools are going to be, more of like kind of like a Phoenix school that's being taught online, or what's going on with colleges today?
Oh, that's a big question. I haven't researched it in depth, so most of what I say is based on reading newspaper articles. I think that the smaller schools that are focused on liberal arts will probably be hurt most by these developments, especially the schools that have relatively modest or no endowments. The larger schools, whether we're talking about Rutgers or Penn State, will weather the storm, I suspect, and even if their students aren't altogether happy with the way that online instruction goes for the next few semesters.
Okay.
Envision that even some of the larger schools are going to suffer because of budgetary implications that follow from their residence halls. And the residence halls, at least as near as I can tell, at many of the schools will not be anywhere near capacity. They'll probably have them at 30 to 50% of what they normally hold. And you still have to heat the building and maintain the building, and as a result, they're going to take a hit that way. We'll probably learn a little bit about ways that we can use online instruction in ways that are complementary to the classroom experience. I know I've discovered a few things about videos that I may not have discovered otherwise. But at a place like TCNJ, the product we're selling, I believe, is for the most part that one-on-one contact with faculty. That is, the faculty should be accessible, and generally the expectation of students at a school like TCNJ is that they'll be able to easily access faculty, walk into their office, and have a somewhat lengthy conversation about class material or current events.
That's the point I was going to make, is it seems like so much of your college experience is based on those social interactions with your professors, your classmates, and everything going on campus. Well, who
Right,
knows?
that's what you're paying all that money for. Otherwise,
Exactly.
you might just take online courses at Arizona State.
Yeah, right. It's very true.
They've
And
been
so,
working on that product for some time, and they're pretty good at delivering it.
yeah, there's all different ways to definitely take on some education, including podcasts, just like these today.
Let's hope
And
so.
you and me both. So, what have you been up to lately as far as some of your research? I know we spoke a little bit about your expertise in policing and experimental and behavioral economics, But just for the layman, can you explain a little bit of what exactly that is and what your goals are with that research?
Well, in recent years, a lot of my research has been driven by conversations with students, and this crime paper, really the first of my career, followed from a discussion I had with a student who's the co-author on the paper, Brian Connor. He's now a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania,
Okay.
but he was scheduled to complete his senior thesis with me a couple of years ago, and walked into my office and said, I'd like to study Black Lives Matter. And, well, I really don't know anything at all about Black Lives Matter. This was a couple of years ago. Why don't you see if you can find some data? This is my typical response.
Okay.
Because in order to analyze something in any sort of detailed way, we need to get at least some reliable data. So he went off and he found this fantastic data set on the internet that's described in the article called Killed by Police. And what they'd done by aggregating information across a series of websites and checking through journalistic sources is listed every incident in the country from 2013 onward where the police killed somebody.
Okay.
And I thought, wow, maybe there's something we can do with this. At the time, there was already a relatively large literature extending back a couple of decades into the causes of police use of force, and in particular with an intent to determine whether it was driven by racial animus. That is, was there discrimination that that fueled this use of force by police against a citizen? So I figured, well, that area was pretty well plowed over. Let's think about the consequences of this use of force. And then I started to think about, well, how do we measure the outcomes that follow from the use of force? And I decided the best way to go was to look at murders, because if we look at other measures of crime, as disorder rises, then it may be that people don't report that somebody broke into their garage and stole their bicycle.
Mm-hmm.
During a riot, the police are unlikely to be concerned about crimes like that. Whereas murders, there's a body that has to be accounted for typically, and the general consensus is that there isn't any mismeasurement, or there's relatively little mismeasurement of murders. So that's how that project evolved. I tell a similar story for another project that's nearing completion about sanctuary cities.
Okay.
And I could go on, but it's a relatively similar story about a student raising an issue and then going off in search of data, and some surprises that cropped up in the process of trying to get a handle on what was driving sanctuary city policies.
Okay. Yeah, well, I definitely want to get into some of that. And it sounds like your students are not shying away from touchy subjects right now. These are
Not at all. In fact, and that makes me more likely to do it, I guess, because if I get in trouble, I can just say that, hey, it was their idea.
Yep, you didn't come up with it. And so
And go ahead.
I was just going to say the I guess the first one that we could start with, the paper that was, got quite a bit of attention. You said that the main data that you had been looking at was murders, and now are we speaking about murders amongst citizens, murders by police officers, or both? Like, what, just to frame the conversation there, what was some of that research?
Murders among citizens where the police are not murdering a person, right? Because we want to use the police murders to explain subsequent changes in disorder, right? And that disorder measurement is the level of murders among citizens.
Okay. And
Okay, so
what?
the police shoot somebody, we want to see whether that causes some sort of social chaos. And our
Okay.
measurement of social chaos is how many people get murdered at some later date.
Okay, so you're looking at if a police officer uses lethal force, what is the aftermath of that?
Exactly. So it could
That's
be a struggle over a gun, or the person attacks the police officer with an axe.
so when somebody, dies at an incident with a police officer. And what were some of your findings from all of that research? And again, that was from 2013 up until today.
The data set that we constructed ran from 2013 through 2015.
Okay.
And what we had to do was pair the data that I've described from the Killed by Police website with other data from the FBI that tracks the level of murders in US cities. So what we did was we decided to look at the 100 largest US cities over this 3-year period. And what was critical was that we were able to get monthly data, because we expected that this reaction that followed police use of lethal force would be relatively short-lived. That is, you'd get a blip sometime after the police shoot somebody in terms of disorder, and
Hmm.
in relatively short order, in typical circumstances, the disorder would recede. So we needed relatively frequent observations on our measure of disorder. So we have monthly data on murders.
Okay. And now with that, I know that we're going to bring to light your findings, but was there a problem and a solution that you were hoping to find? Because I mean, it sounds like if we look at this, I don't think any police officer in a confrontation in the heat of the moment would be thinking, "Hey, what's going to be the aftermath 3 weeks from today?" As perhaps I'm fighting for my life or dealing with an emotionally charged incident that could end up in somebody dying.
Well, I guess I would have to concede your point if we were speaking about some incident 10 years ago. I'm not as sure that that's true today, given the amount of pressure the police are under and the amount of public discussion of the issue.
Okay. And so
So the police
ultimately,
have to be thinking about these disorder effects that follow. That doesn't mean they shouldn't defend themselves,
mhm,
but I should give you the two basic reasons that we want to look at this. One of them we've essentially covered already. That is, we want to try to gauge the disorder that follows from police use of lethal force. That is, how counterproductive are these shootings, if at all? And
okay,
as it turns out, there's some evidence that suggests that they may not be. The
okay,
second issue, though, is we want to try to understand what makes policing effective, that in some areas versus others. So just to give you a statistic that when I first looked at it, it was just shocking to me. I don't know whether this will shock you, but it really shocked me. So if you rank the 100 largest cities in the US based on the murder rate, so top to bottom, ranking them, the cities at the top differ from the cities at the bottom. Now, mind you, these are all cities with substantial populations, more than 200,000 people, right?
okay,
So we're not talking about tiny towns. So the 100 largest cities, top to bottom, the murder rate differs by a factor of 50. And for some of these cities, it's at the very top versus the very bottom, it's almost a factor of 100. So in places like St. Louis, Detroit, Baltimore, and New Orleans,
hmm
the murder rate is higher by a factor of 50 compared to other large cities.
Okay, and can you define the factor of 50 just for people who may not be
It's
familiar?
50 times larger, the
So
murder
you're
rate.
saying the murder
The
rate
murder
at
rate per
those top few
100,000.
cities, okay, could be 50 times higher than the cities that were at the bottom, 95, 96, those cities
Ex-
towards the
exactly right,
bottom.
Brian.
That
So,
is,
so
that's an
those are huge
astronomical, yeah,
disparities,
sure.
absolutely enormous. And you can't explain it just by reference to differences in income or racial variables. So the effort here is to try to understand what's driving these variations in murder rates or disorder uh, across cities. And if I had to say it in one word, it's trust. That is, it's this trust relationship between police and citizens that is an absolute prerequisite for effective policing. When the trust breaks down, uh, a variety of other undesirable consequences follow, and I'll try to trace those out.
And just to interrupt real quick, so to clarify, when you say that it's a factor of 50, 50 times greater, are you talking about just the overall murder rate, or you're talking about incidents with police officers?
I'm speaking about the overall murder rate. There's also a huge amount of variation in the rate that police shoot citizens across cities, but that variation is a bit smaller.
And you feel that that overall murder rate has to do with trust? You said that that's what you were identifying?
To my mind, there's no other way to explain it.
Okay.
And so
And can
that
you elaborate on that?
one of the big themes that we're trying to tease out of this is better information on trust as a key determinant of disorder or effective policing. Okay, so that we want to think about this as a two-sided problem. Okay, so that if the police don't trust citizens, they can't get cooperation from citizens, or they feel like if they take action to suppress crime, maybe they'll put together a drug bust or do some other discretionary activity aimed at suppressing crime. That subjects the police to risk, right? There'll be risk that they'll upset somebody, there'll be a complaint, and if the local district attorney is so inclined, there'll be a prosecution against the police. So many times under these circumstances, the rational response on the part of the police is to simply pull back and only respond to calls and undertake police activity that's absolutely required. So any discretionary policing, like drug busts or prostitution stings or the like, is curtailed or eliminated.
Okay.
And there's evidence compiled elsewhere that shows that when you have these high-profile incidents between police and citizens, like the Ferguson incident, the police will pull back and you get less
Okay.
policing. On
Interesting.
the other
So
hand, go ahead.
so if I understand correctly, your hypothesis, which it sounds, if I'm correct, like pretty unique in that you don't believe these Chicago's, Baltimore's, New Orleans areas like that have such high murder rates because of economic factors or poverty or other issues, but that more it's the interaction between the people who live there and the police force.
Well, I don't want to deny that poverty and some of these other factors explain some of the variations in murder rates that we see across locations in the US. My argument is it can't be the whole story because you can't account for the variations that we're seeing solely by reference to income or unemployment or race.
Is that because you found some of those cities that were at the bottom of the list had a similar dynamic, but a totally different murder rate?
Right. The data is analyzed across all the cities. So I didn't try to break it out based on the murder rate in the city. We're just analyzing the 100 largest cities to see if we can tease out these factors. There's
Okay.
a number of extensions to this data that we can speak about later if you like.
Okay. And so what happened, it sounds like that the police feel that they have to act in a certain way, either to be more aggressive or take a more lax approach to maybe smaller crimes because of how some of these interactions might be construed or what the higher ups are telling them.
Right, right. In the event of one of these high profile shootings, the police are subject to more scrutiny. That
Hmm.
greater scrutiny may cause them to change their behavior in a way that facilitates more crime.
Okay. And so when there's been these high profile things, you're finding that they back off more than kind of turn up the heat, so so to say, on their population.
Correct. And I would say that to finish the story about the two-sided problem, the citizens themselves, when they lose trust in the police, first off, won't call 911 with the same frequency, but they tend to then resort to threats of violence or actual violence to protect themselves, their family, or their property. Right, so that you have your running buddies, and your relationship with them is to back them up when they get in trouble and to exact retribution from people that have somehow trespassed against your running buddies. And to the extent that you don't follow through on that, then you're out of the group and you can't count on them to save you when you need protection of some sort. But as you might imagine, when arrangements, private arrangements like this evolve, it breeds more violence.
Hmm.
And very often the idea is, I better shoot that guy before he shoots me.
So more kind of taking it into their own hands type of approach.
Exactly.
Okay. And do you think that this has been going on, for decades, or at least what it appears to me is since the advent of a cell phone that can capture video and photo, that these incidents now are front page news? And so were they happening behind the scenes forever, or are these interactions that are so volatile? Is this something new that really has come about over the past 10 years?
Well, I would say yes and no. Yes, the cell phone cameras and social media give these events wider exposure and probably change the dynamic. But these events have always taken place, or at least as far back as there's been policing, probably over the course of the
Sure.
20th century. And the groups of people who were affected are relatively small in number. So studies show that about 80% of the murders in your typical city occur in only about 5% of the area of the city. So that what you get are crime hotspots. And the
Okay.
people who live in these crime hotspots have ways of finding out what the police did that are separate from social media. You might get a little bit more of a word of mouth interaction as opposed to internet communication.
Okay.
But I would contend that this dynamic, at least to some extent, has been present long before there was an internet. But I would concede that the internet probably altered in some way the way the information was conveyed.
Yep. Yeah, now it's you can find pretty much anything on the internet, whether it's true or false. There's certainly going to be enough people to agree with it. And so now with all this goings-ons, obviously going back to the genesis of this paper and why that student brought it up to you, I was hoping to speak about Black Lives Matter. So could you talk a little bit about what you found as far as implications for groups such as Black Lives Matter, or now the huge, motion to try and defund the police? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. Let me step back and give you the main
Sure.
results first. So the
Okay.
main results, that is over this full data set, 2013 through 2015. And it's important to note that right in the middle of the data set, Ferguson occurs. Okay, so Michael Brown is killed by the police
Yep.
in Ferguson, Missouri, in August of 2014.
Yep.
And that's right in the center of my data that runs from January 2013 through December 2015.
Okay.
And what we find over the full data set is that when the police shoot somebody, or I should say more correctly, when the police use lethal force, that is, they take an action and they kill somebody in the line of duty. Now, most of the time they're shot, but not always. Okay, so we've got all lethal force incidents.
Okay.
2 months later, murders rise by about 2%. And it's
Interesting.
important that we have this time lag between the two items. That is because you can certainly imagine that when the police shoot somebody, there's also more likely to be a murder at the spot.
Yep.
So when the consequence occurs 2 months later, it means that some sort of disorder occurred as the result of the police action.
Okay. And two questions real quick to that. So you tracked a 2% increase. Is that nationwide murders or in that particular vicinity, in that city where
It's in
it
that
occurred?
city.
Okay. And is 2%, as an economist, is that a meaningful increase, or is that negligible, an amount that small?
Well, that's a good question. I would say even if it's negligible, we've got evidence that the mechanism about trust is operating.
Okay.
Okay, so it's true that in your typical month here, you've only got about 6 murders. So 2% of 6 is a very, very small bump.
Hmm.
But we've also got almost 1,000 incidents of the police shooting somebody. And
Okay.
so 2% of 1,000, you've got 20 extra murders there.
Okay. Okay. So you could definitely notice a slight uptick.
And the other important element of these results is that if we look at the period prior to Ferguson, and this is the most surprising thing to me when I went through the data, prior to Ferguson, when the police killed somebody, 2 months later, the murder rate went up by 4.5%.
Okay. Anything that
After
you can
Ferguson,
point to for that?
I'm sorry.
I said anything that you could account for in that respect, or is maybe because it was so kind of high profile of an incident?
Well, here's my story. That if we look at, and this probably won't come as a surprise, given that the result for the entire data set was 2%. Prior to Ferguson, it's 4.5%. The effect disappears after Ferguson.
Huh.
So that in general, when the police shoot somebody after Ferguson, the murder rate falls slightly 3 months after the event, on average.
Okay.
So what that suggests to me is that the police took action, at least collectively. We're dealing with 93 police departments, collectively took some sort of action so as to increase trust. I can't say based on my data exactly what that was. So it could be that it was body cameras. It could be that they banned certain types of police practices like chokeholds. I have to do more digging to try to find out why the effect of police shootings on disorder is very different before Ferguson than it is after Ferguson.
Hmm. That is interesting. That's definitely perhaps something to look further into.
And so what it suggests is that at least some of these protests that are happening now may, as shocking as it might seem to advocates for the police, and I suppose I consider myself to be one, there might be some good that comes from it.
Certainly. Yeah, I hope so. I think with a lot of these things, there could be some good consequences and then some negative unintended consequences.
Correct.
And maybe that can kind of lead back to what we wanted to discuss of right now with Black Lives Matter being, so noticeable and all these chants for defund the police. What is to come of that? Like, can you talk a little bit of what you anticipate that leading to?
Yeah, sure. To the extent that either of these movements undermine the trust between police and citizens, crime will rise. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of major cities in the last month and a half. That is, these efforts to defund the police haven't as yet reduced the number of police on the street. And in fact, many cities have increased the number of police.
Interesting.
So to the extent that crime is surging, it's consistent with the story, at least in my view, that I'm trying to tell about the importance of trust between police and citizens in suppressing crime. When the trust disappears, crime surges because people try to protect their life and limb using violence and threats of violence, and the police, fearing more scrutiny, pull back and undertake fewer discretionary anti-crime activities. So I think that's what we're seeing on the streets, and that's one of the bad things, I would argue, that's following from the so-called defund the police movement. Because at least as near as I can tell, none of the budget changes have affected police on the street just yet. So it's got to be something about sentiment that's driving the crime up.
Yeah.
And I believe that that's the essential dynamic that I captured in my earlier data set.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like such a crazy time where you see these videos every night where they got a protest going on and then people are smashing through windows, stealing stuff, and there's police officers standing there right in the street that seem like they're emasculated, like they're just, watching this stuff go on, that any other time you think that these guys would be thrown in jail for who knows how long. And now it seems like they can't do anything.
Yeah, and if I could make an analogy that I hope a financial planner will love, is that this confidence relationship is very similar to the relationship that the Federal Reserve has with investors.
Okay.
With regard to interest rate pronouncements, to the extent that people trust the Fed to keep interest rates low for a long time, that's going to have a much larger impact on borrowing activity than when they don't trust the Fed.
That's a good point. I like the analogy. And I think a lot of these things, not to cut you off, become so politicized. And I've never seen the Fed under such scrutiny too, where, it's like the administration and the Fed will go back and forth saying what should or shouldn't be done. And I think that does have an effect on the markets and what investors are planning for their future.
This Fed administration battle, you'd have to go back to the 1970s to find similar incidents.
Yeah,
it's a shame.
No, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And so, in going back to Black Lives Matter, defund the police, what I think the fear that I would have, and I think a lot of people have, is it seems like what started as Black Lives Matter, we're trying to do good and protect Black lives, obviously, has become almost like the antithesis to support police. And so one of the things I was just watching the other day on the news is like with the NFL, for so long it seemed like the NFL, you'd watch any football game, they were supporting the military all the way through from the kickoff to the end of the game. And there was constantly a show of support for blue. And there was talk everywhere. And there was, the thin blue line and those flags seen everywhere. And now all of a sudden, it seems like, the military we don't need to worry about. But when we talk about policing, it seems like there's no way they can even bring it up that they're possibly supporting that right now. And you're seeing the NBA, the MLB, and the NFL all taking initiatives to promote Black Lives Matter in a very, very big way.
Yeah,
And
it has been a very dramatic shift.
it's huge. It's huge. And so it seems like they have drawn a line in the sand and they've taken a side in that debate without question. And they have such a way to censor their athletes and, who have such a huge platform as far as what they can say or do. So what's to come of that? Because when you talk about that, this all comes back to trust between the community and the police force. And now we're drawing a divide right there. And I don't want to say that they're almost making the blue the enemy, but a lot of people will interpret it that way.
Yeah, it's hard to know what your average person understands with regard to Black Lives Matter. If you go to the website for the organization, they take some very controversial political positions that I highly doubt your average American agrees with. And so I have to wonder whether you've got an effect that follows from a shocking video of the Minneapolis incident with George Floyd and the primary, I guess, political organization set up to prevent such actions, realizing a huge benefit from just the highly emotional content of that video. And over time, perhaps the policies espoused by Black Lives Matter will receive a bit more scrutiny. And we're starting to see some pushback. That is, I've seen a couple of polls recently that show that your average inner city resident does not want to see cuts in the police budget.
Yeah, I think defunding the police would affect a crime-ridden city more than anywhere else.
I think
If
that's
you take away
exactly
that law
right.
and order.
Exactly right. And the people who suffer most from disorder in the cities are poor people, primarily minorities. So I think one of the key facts that's been lost in all of this discussion with regard to policing is that Black men are 7 times more likely to be murdered than white men. Young Black men are 14 times more likely to be murdered than young white men. And most murders are within racial groups. So 90% of Black victims have Black assailants.
Exactly. I mean, I just saw on the news a statistic. It was from the FBI in 2018 that said 2,925 African Americans were murdered, and 2,600 of those were by fellow African Americans.
So
Wow.
when the police pull back from these locations, Black men suffer dramatically.
So that's what I struggle with is why are they not understanding that if we're piecing together the puzzle and we say, okay, Black Lives Matter right now has the microphone and they're saying defund the police. But then if we look at the statistics, it doesn't seem like it takes a lot of, thinking to kind of draw the connection here. I don't understand how it still has such a strong footing.
Yeah, it's hard to know. You have a large number of voices speaking for Black Lives Matter, and it's hard to draw inferences about exactly what their motives might be separate from the ones that are posted on their website. But I found it interesting that the city that's had the longest protests in the wake of this George Floyd murder has been one of the whitest cities in the country, Portland. Portland,
Portland.
Oregon
Yep.
has only about 6% Black residents.
That's
It's
incredible.
they've got heavy levels of land use regulation. It's very hard to build anything in Portland, and the housing prices are very high. And you have to wonder what might be causing Portland, as opposed to, say, St. Louis, to have much more protest activity. I think that there's probably some interesting propositions that you could tease out of a decent data set on that question. But that remains to be done. So what I'm doing now is only speculating.
Fair enough. And that's a very eye-opening finding. Some of it just doesn't quite seem to make sense. And so, you've done a lot of study on the topic. What are some of the more important unanswered questions that were raised? And I guess to round things out on the subject, are there solutions here? I know we can find a lot of things that will open our eyes. Some people want to ignore them and ignore the truth, but what are some of the solutions to the questions that are coming from this?
Yeah, well, the first solution is that if crime in cities is driven by this trust relationship, you want to make sure that in the wake of protests, every action on both sides is taken with an eye towards preserving that trust relationship. That is, the police shouldn't ever be rejecting out of hand any reform proposals. They should be thinking about these complaints and trying to respond to them in the most constructive way. Because the last thing you want to do if you're running a police department is come off as high-handed. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true with the communities. Don't tear down the police. It's going to create even more problems to the extent that the police feel that they're under fire. Sure. So if your average officer on the street thinks that the residents that he's responsible for policing hate him, you're not going to get good outcomes. So we want to keep an eye on that. If that was the one thing I could say, that would be the main implication of this. And it's not unique to me. A couple of other people have made this point recently.
Sure.
Other unanswered questions are, well, how much of this shift that we saw after Ferguson was the result of things like body cameras or changes in practices or outreach? And I don't know the answer to that, and I'd like to try to in the future dig up some data to get an answer to those questions. That is, what caused that shift, pre-Ferguson versus post-Ferguson? And just to, again, reiterate what I said was that prior to Ferguson, when the police killed somebody, the murder rate went up by about 4.5%. 2 months after the police used lethal force. After Ferguson, when the police killed somebody, the murder rate went down about 3%, 3 months following the incident. But the other thing is that prior to Ferguson, there was no racial. It didn't matter whether the police shot a black man or a white man. After Ferguson, if the police shot somebody who was white, the crime rate or the murder rate fell 3 months after the event. Whereas if they shot somebody who was black, it rose about 2%. So you got this racial difference that you didn't have after Ferguson, even though in the aggregate, the effect of the police shooting on subsequent murders was lower after Ferguson. I don't know. That's a little bit confusing. Was that?
It's a little bit, but to summarize that, so it sounds like post Ferguson, if I understood what you just said correctly, that the if the police had used lethal force on a black individual, the murder rate had gone up, whereas if it was on a white individual, the murder rate had actually gone down. Is that what you said?
Yes, yes. And the other interesting fact here is the number of incidents isn't changing over time.
Yeah.
So what that suggests is the interpretation or the meaning of those incidents changes post Ferguson, because the actual number is unaffected.
Huh. That's interesting, and I'd be curious to see, some of that data now, like post George Floyd, where this is something that we've never seen before.
Yeah. Well, the FBI that compiles the data is usually about a year or two behind in releasing the month-to-month murder levels, but you might be able to find the data on individual city websites now.
Gotcha. Got it. Anything else that's worth noting in respect to a lot of that research on police and use of lethal force? And like I said, definitely a timely topic, but a very sensitive one that we're all dealing with right now. I think when you combine it with a worldwide pandemic, it's a pressure cooker that's getting a little bit out of hand.
Yeah, that's a point that we haven't spoken about at all. How much of the current unrest is being fueled by the high level of unemployment, coupled with the government checks that are coming in?
Why do the government checks have anything to do with that? What?
Well, that people have a little bit of money to do things.
Mm-hmm.
They're not as pressed for survival, but they've got lots of time on their hands.
Sure. Interesting.
And this is all speculation on my part, so I don't know for sure. But I'm just picking up on your thought and arguing that I think that there's something to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could just notice, by the way, the quarantine, before George Floyd was such a serious action that, it was insane to see the streets of populated cities that were just empty. And then as soon as that happened, it's like, what quarantine? And before you know it, like hundreds of thousands of people are congregating all over the country. So it was very interesting to see the outlooks on some of these change so quickly.
True enough, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure, I know we talked quite a bit there, but if you wanted to touch on some of your more recent research, I know you said was on the sanctuary cities that you were looking into those. I know, for lack of a better segue, is there any correlation between the two subjects, or at least anything that you want to share on some of that research that you think, the listeners should know about?
Wow. It's a longer story, and I have to make a bunch of subtle distinctions to differentiate what people typically understood about these sanctuary cities and what I'm finding in my data. But I'll make an attempt and hope for the best. Right. So that the relatively small number of papers that try to understand the determinants of these sanctuary cities focus on ideology. That is, the primary dividing line between a sanctuary location and a non-sanctuary location is a degree of openness that characterizes these sanctuary locations versus a adherence to tradition and a a certain level of restrictionism, if you will. So this is the way that people have typically analyzed this issue. I'm taking a slightly different angle on the issue and arguing that land use issues are important in this dynamic. And ideology is typically captured in these analyses using things like, well, the share of the vote that went to Obama in 2012. My argument is that ideology is multifaceted, and in fact, the liberal cities, and think San Francisco here,
Mm-hmm.
are much more heavily regulated. That is, they've got high levels of land use regulation. It's very, very, very difficult to build something in San Francisco. It's relatively easy to build something in Houston, for instance.
Okay.
So there you can set up a sort of a contrast between those two cities as prototypes for heavy land use regulation versus light land use regulation. The other important element here is that cities that have lots of land use regulation also have a lot of labor market regulation. And that might be licensing things like plumbers.
Mm-hmm.
It might be minimum wage regulation, or a set of other items related to occupational classifications.
Okay.
Unions are also important elements in this. So
So
as it
to
turns
to recap what you're saying, it sounds like you said liberal cities, that it's harder to build in, harder to find or get a job because of all these extra regulations. Those are more of the sanctuary cities. Is that what you had said?
exactly right. Exactly. That is, the sanctuary cities have much higher levels of regulation.
Why is that? That almost sounds like a contradiction.
It does. I think that in general, liberals have much less faith in markets as a way to organize economic activity. That is, they see individual decisions as having much more in the way of spillover effects, or the technical term that I'm sure you're familiar with, externalities, are
Sure.
greater. So that I can't let you pave 40% of that lot. It's going to cause problems for me the next time it rains. Or if you build that development, it's going to cause traffic, which increases my commute to work. So that people who have much more of a liberal orientation tend to see these effects as much more important. And they need, or they believe that government should be involved in preventing the unintended consequences of market decisions by regulating.
In that, I can understand that viewpoint, for people that have that kind of liberal viewpoint. But what seems weird is they say, like, let's say San Francisco, they want to get over regulation where they can have quite a bit of control on what's going on there. But then you would think a sanctuary city is like the ultimate in deregulation, where I still don't totally understand how they exist. It seems like it's against the law, but I don't know. Maybe I don't have a firm understanding on the sanctuary cities, but wouldn't you qualify that as something that's completely deregulated?
Well, they want to prevent federal interference in decisions about immigration law in their cities. That is, they want to refuse to enforce the federal immigration law. They don't want to aid the federal government in enforcing immigration law. And I can see how you're making the point that isn't that contrary to high levels of regulation. And I concede your point, but I I see it in the data. So that I would concede that perhaps there's a inconsistency in their behavior, but it's there nevertheless.
Got
That
it.
is, the cities that have these, who have made these sanctuary declarations, who have the sanctuary policies in place, are also cities that have higher levels of regulation of labor markets and land use. And here's the kicker. That is, that higher level of land use regulation and labor market regulation makes it more expensive to live in those cities. And those cities are experiencing decreases in the percentage of the population that's non-citizens.
It makes
So the
sense.
non-citizen population, as a percentage of the total, is declining in the liberal cities with the sanctuary declarations, but not declining in the locations that have not made sanctuary declarations.
Wow, it's it's definitely a weird time,
Yeah,
and I see the data. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but I guess what I would say is there like a hypothesis to this? And I think that's what a lot of people maybe sometimes, I don't want to say get annoyed by, but don't understand about economics is like, okay, you brought up a really great point that we didn't see, that in liberal cities that are overregulated, they become sanctuary, cities or have that element. And then citizens there that would work otherwise are moving out and non-citizens are living there naturally because it's a sanctuary city. So it's an interesting finding, but is there, I guess, a point to it, or is there's something that, um, from a political standpoint, one would say, hey, that's good, or hey, that's bad, or should we do something about it?
yeah. So again, this is a long and confusing issue. I'll try to do my best
I'm sorry to drag you into it.
concisely express what I think is going on. So what I think is going on is that political parties are groups of people who want to control the government. This is a long-running model in political science. And to the extent that you're a typical resident that knows that this regulation is keeping your house price high and protecting your livelihood, you want to keep that regulation in place because you're a beneficiary, you're an insider.
Okay.
But that's not a winning political coalition. So you need another position to get enough votes to prevail in the next election. And so that you adopt these positions like sanctuary as a way to build a winning political coalition and retain power and keep those regulations in place. Because as it turns out, the sanctuary regulations, once they're put in place, or the sanctuary policies, I should say, once they're put in place, don't in any way decrease the outflow of non-citizens from these sanctuary locations. That is, they're completely ineffective, and they're apparently, at least judging by migration decisions, not valued at all by non-citizens, which is a category that includes undocumented immigrants.
Hmm.
But it would take me another hour to sort of lay out the data that I've got and what sort of analyses I've done to support this. And the paper is, I hope, just a couple of months away from publication. It's under revision at a journal.
Okay. Yeah, I look forward to reading that.
I will
Yeah, these
send
are.
it to you as soon as I have a final version.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I'd love to look at that. So these have been two, very emotionally charged, politically charged. You could kind of pick the adjective here. Topics
Mm-hmm.
on policing in sanctuary cities. They're certainly talked about constantly on the news right now. But I appreciate you sharing, your findings and some of this data here. And hopefully more and more people can understand the data and make informed decisions. With respect to the sanctuary cities, like I like that you mentioned that there's beneficiaries to both sides of these equations. And so what might seem like dirty politics to one person might seem like something that's protecting my job or protecting my way of life to another person.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that, but I think on the policing side, based on a lot of the data that you shared, the fear is, I think that there may be some unintended consequences to what sound like good motives or good messages, and I think that's something that people really have to understand. That you had shared there. Defund the police is something that could strip law and order from the exact cities that are most plagued by problems that need police. Um, so I don't know if we have solutions here, but hopefully other people can look at all the data you shared and maybe come up with some solutions.
Yeah, well, I'm not the only person working on these topics, so
Yeah.
I'm sure there'll be some progress. But to the extent that I'm able to get my story out there, I'm happy.
Yeah, definitely. And just to maybe close, do you feel like the pendulum swings? Because from my standpoint, it seems like Black Lives Matter, going back to policing, has become so present, especially in sports, which has such a grip on America. And you're going to see, opening day now today for baseball, that every single pitcher's mound will have BLM, etched into it, and it's everywhere. And a lot of people now, unfortunately, are taking that as an anti-blue movement, and you wonder if it'll go too far. And then those same people that embraced it, such as the NBA or the NFL and so on, could then shun it as they continue just to kind of move with whatever they think is going to put them in a positive light or get the most eyeballs on their shows or their events. Do you feel like there is that pendulum effect over time?
Yeah, almost certainly. Yeah, that is, actors on both sides are trying to put in place policies that they prefer or that benefit their group, and the public understanding of these issues will evolve over time. I think that the surge in crime that's occurred since the George Floyd murder is coloring the debate over the police reforms, and I hope what's a productive way. That is, people are recognizing that shutting down police departments entirely is very dangerous, and it's most dangerous to poor inner city residents. So I'm hoping that things will move in a productive direction, but of course I don't want to offer any guarantees.
Yeah, we never can. No guarantees in economics. So thank you so much for being on the show. And do you have any closing remarks or anything that you'd like to share with our listeners before we sign off today?
No, other than to thank you for inviting me onto the show, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about these research projects, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank
We
you.
TCNJ people have to stick together.
That's right. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna, and today we've been joined by Dr. Donald Vandegrift, a professor at the College of New Jersey. And thanks so much for being on the show and sharing so much insight for us. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care. The Caderna podcast is for informational purposes only. Individual situations may vary, and the information should be relied upon only when coordinated with individual professional advice. Guardian and its subsidiaries do not provide tax, legal, Social Security, student loan, mortgage, or real estate advice. Listeners should contact their own tax, accounting, or legal advisors or the Social Security Department in this matter. All investments and investment strategies contain risk and may lose value. Brian Caderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, Pass, 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Securities, product services, and advisory services are offered through Pass, a registered broker-dealer and investment advisor, not 973-244-4420. Financial representative, the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. Pass is an indirect, wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Caderna Financial Team and International Planning Alliance, LLC, are not affiliates or subsidiaries of Pass or Guardian. Caderna Financial Team is a division of International Planning Alliance, LLC, a general agency of Guardian. Pass is a member of FINRA, SIPC. California Insurance License Number OK04194. Content of the Caderna podcast is copyright of Brian M. Caderna, all rights reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of part or all of the content in any form is prohibited without prior permission from the Caderna podcast. The views and opinions expressed herein may not be those of Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. Guardian does not verify and does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of the information or opinions presented herein. Any third-party materials referenced cannot be endorsed or verified by Guardian and are used as the opinion of the author. Guardian, its subsidiaries, or affiliates do not provide or issue or advise for mortgages. This material contains the current opinions of the author, but not necessarily those of Guardian or its subsidiaries, and such opinions are subject to change without notice.